In 1870, during the Revolution, the Spanish remember as La Gloriosa, somebody bribed a crypt guard, lifted the lid on a dead emperor's coffin, and walked off with a piece of his finger. The fragment changed hands, drifted into a private collection, and sat there for more than a century. When researchers finally got it under a microscope in 2004, the bone told them, in clinical detail, how the most powerful man in 16th century Europe had been coming apart while he still sat on his throne. His name was Charles V. If that does not ring a bell, it is a small injustice of memory, because for roughly 40 years he was the nearest thing his century had to a man who ruled the world. Spain answered to him. The Americas, freshly and violently conquered, answered to him. So did the Holy Roman Empire, most of Italy, the Netherlands, and a long scatter of Central European lands. He was born in February of 1500 in Ghent, in what is now Belgium, tall and pale and fair-haired, with the kind of Burgundian look that would later read as faintly foreign inside the Spanish court he ended up running. Through a streak of dynastic luck that bordered on the ridiculous, he inherited 4 separate royal bloodlines at once. His grandmother Mary of Burgundy passed down the Netherlands and Burgundy. Ferdinand and Isabella, his mother's parents, passed down Spain and everything Spain was busy seizing across the ocean. His grandfather Maximilian passed down the claim to the Holy Roman Empire. 4 crowns, give or take, landed on one young man who had done nothing to earn them except be born in exactly the right bed at exactly the right moment, after a run of well-timed deaths upstream of him in the family. By his 20s, he was the most over-inherited human being in Europe. By the end, he could not walk across a room to reach any of it. The monastery of Yuste sits in Extremadura, in the dry hills of western Spain. Early in 1557, there is an old man in a small room there, and the room has been built with a doorway that opens straight onto the chapel, so that when his legs and hands seize up, he can still hear Mass from the bed without anyone lifting him. His fingers are too swollen to close around a pen. He gives his orders aloud and a secretary writes them down. He is 56 years old. He looks 2 decades past it. The thing that wrecked him was gout, and for once we are not guessing at a dead man's medicine from second-hand descriptions. That finger taken in 1870 was the distal phalanx of his little finger, the small bone at the very tip. It was lifted during the upheaval the Spanish call La Gloriosa, when the old political order wobbled, and a crypt guard apparently decided a dead Habsburg was worth more in fragments than left whole. Money changed hands. A piece of an emperor was, in the plainest sense of the word, sold off to a private buyer like a coin or a stamp. What the 2004 examination found inside that bone is the part worth slowing down for, because it is the rare case where the body testifies against the legend. Under polarized light, the tissue was packed with acicular crystals, meaning needle-shaped, and the needles showed birefringence, which is the optical trick where a crystal splits light into 2 paths at once and flares up when you rotate the lens. That property is the fingerprint mineralogists hunt for. Chemical and colorimetric tests then settled what the needles were actually made of. Uric acid. The same compound that collects in the joints of gout sufferers hardens into solid crystal and turns an ordinary knuckle into something that feels packed with ground glass. The bone around those deposits was eroded and partly destroyed. Whoever owned this finger had advanced joint-grinding gout. The finger was Charles's. There is something quietly fitting about the fact that this is how we know any of it. The emperor's enemies wrote propaganda about him while he lived. His admirers wrote flattery. Every surviving account of the man came pre-bent by someone's purpose. The bone had none. It could not flatter and it could not accuse. Sealed inside a finger for 4.5 centuries, it kept a record no chronicler could quietly edit, and when it was finally read, it described not a conqueror and not a saint, but a body coming apart at the joints, exactly as the disease would predict. It helps to understand what gout actually does to a person, because the polite modern shorthand for it, the rich man's foot complaint, badly undersells the reality. The body normally flushes uric acid out through the kidneys. When it cannot keep pace, the acid saturates the blood and starts dropping out of solution as solid crystals, and it tends to do this first in the coolest, most distant joints, the toes and the fingertips. Those crystals are sharp at the microscopic scale. The immune system swarms them as if they were a foreign invader. The joint swells and reddens and burns, and across years the deposits pile higher, warp the joint out of shape, and grind into the bone underneath. A bad flare can make the weight of a single bedsheet feel like punishment. Charles lived inside that for decades. When the attacks were at their worst, he was carried between rooms on a litter. Letters of state went out in another man's handwriting because the emperor's own hand had quit on him. The doorway between his bedroom and the chapel was not monastic charm or piety. It was a workaround for a ruler whose joints had stopped cooperating with him. Here is where one sick king turns into something closer to a closed laboratory, because the gout did not arrive out of nowhere, and neither did the jaw. Charles carried the famous Habsburg jaw his whole life, the long undershot lower mandible that physicians call prognathism, and his version was pronounced enough that people around him noted he had trouble chewing and tended to sit with his mouth slightly open. That jaw is the most visible fingerprint of what his family had spent generations doing to itself in the marriage bed. It was not a cosmetic problem either. The lower jaw jutted far enough ahead of the upper that his teeth did not meet properly, which made chewing a daily chore and, by some accounts, left his mouth slightly parted even at rest. Across the generations that came after him, the trait only deepened, until in his descendants, the jaw became the single feature people recognized on sight, the physical signature of a family that had stopped letting in fresh blood. Charles wore an early, milder edition of a deformity his line would eventually carry like a brand. The Habsburgs married their relatives, not occasionally, as a standing policy, decade after decade. 2 studies have run the cold arithmetic on it. A 2009 paper in PLOS One by Alvarez and his colleagues examined 11 marriages across the Spanish branch and found that 9 of them, better than 8 in 10, were between blood relatives, including 2 uncle and niece matches and 1 between double first cousins. A 2013 study in the journal Heredity by Caballos and colleagues went much wider, mapping 73 Habsburg marriages, and found that 29 of them crossed the first cousin line and 13 crossed the tighter uncle-niece threshold. To keep the crowns inside the household kept marrying itself over and over for a century and a half, with the determination of people who genuinely believed their blood was too good to dilute. You can put a single number on the damage. It is called the inbreeding coefficient, written as F, and it estimates the share of a person's gene pairs that are identical, purely because both copies trace back to the same shared ancestor on either side. Charles's own father, Philip the Handsome, sat at an F of around 0.025. Low, barely a footnote. Now travel a century and a half down the same line to the last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II, and that number has climbed to 0.254. Sit with that for a moment. A value near 0.25 is roughly what you would expect from the child of a full brother and a full sister. Charles II scored higher than that, even though his parents were on paper an uncle and a niece rather than siblings. The breeding had folded the family tree back onto itself so many times that the final king of the line was, in genetic terms, the product of something more concentrated than incest between siblings. Charles V sat near the top of that descent. His own parents were first cousins once removed. He was not the ruin of the dynasty, he was its opening note. When you concentrate a bloodline that hard, you concentrate everything riding inside it, and that includes the recessive traits that normally stay hidden from view. A recessive condition needs 2 faulty copies of a gene to surface. With 1 faulty copy and 1 healthy copy, the healthy one masks the problem, and the carrier looks perfectly fine. Cousin marriages, generation stacked on generation, sharply raise the odds that a child inherits the same rare, faulty variant from both sides at the same time. The jaw works that way. The gout fits the same pattern. So does the streak of suspected epilepsy that ran in the family. Europe's grandest dynasty had built itself a machine for keeping power locked inside the household, and the exact same machine was quietly poisoning the bodies it produced. Charles felt the early edge of it in his hands and his jaw. Charles II, several generations on, could barely chew, walk or speak, and died with no child to follow him. What makes those 2 studies worth more than a grim party fact is the gap between what the family believed it was doing and what it was actually doing to itself. On paper, any one marriage carries a single tidy label. Run the arithmetic across many generations of close matches stacked one on the next, though, and the real biological relatedness of any given couple drifts far past what that label admits, because the same small handful of ancestors keeps reappearing on both sides of every branch. The wider of the two surveys caught that drift in a way a single generation never could. The dynasty was not simply marrying close, it was compounding closeness, like interest accruing on a debt that finally came due in the bodies of its children. The empire Charles governed with those failing hands was a strange beast, and it pays to be blunt about what it actually was. It was not a country. It had no capital. There was no central government sitting over the whole thing, no single body of law, no unified treasury running the apparatus. The land shared exactly one feature, and that feature was Charles himself. Pull him out of the picture, and nothing structural held Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, and the German territories inside the same political sentence. He understood this with painful clarity. In a letter to Mary of Hungary, the sister he had installed as his regent in the Netherlands, written in October of 1537, he laid it out with no flattery and no spin. He was only one man, he wrote, and he could not be everywhere. He had to be where he ought to be, and where he could manage to be, and very often only where he could be at all, rather than where he actually wished to go. That is not the voice of a triumphant world ruler. That is a man describing a job that physically cannot be done by anyone. So he did the impossible version of it anyway. He kept moving. Across his reign, he made something on the order of 40 separate journeys through his own territories, turning up in person again and again because his physical presence was the only government those scattered places had in common. In each territory he swore separately to uphold that place's own laws, one by one, because there was no shared legal flaw underneath any of them. He commanded more square miles than any European ruler before him, and he ran the whole sprawling concern out of a saddle, a baggage train, and an endless series of borrowed rooms. A reign spent mostly on bad roads, in all weather, is not a gentle way to treat a body already predisposed to grinding its own joints to powder. He governed everywhere, and rested nowhere. The scale of it is hard to hold in your head even now. His authority reached people who would never share a language, a coastline, or a god, from the silver being torn out of the ground in the Americas to the German princes bickering over theology in cold halls, to the merchant cities of the Low Countries bent over their account books. No single person had ever been answerable for so many unrelated lives at once, scattered across lands that agreed on almost nothing, and had been stapled together by marriages and well-timed funerals rather than any shared idea. It was a workload assembled by accident, and it came down on one mortal frame. That restless travelling rule kept slamming into the two great problems of his life, and the first of them was a single German monk. In April of 1521, at the imperial assembly known as the Diet of Worms, Martin Luther stood in front of the young emperor and refused to take back a word of what he had written against the church. Charles answered in writing, and his reasoning was simple to the point of stubbornness. He pointed to his ancestors and their long obedience to Rome and concluded that one monk setting himself against 1,000 years of Christian belief had to be the one in error, not the 1,000 years. A month later, on the 25th of May, he made it law. The Edict of Worms branded Luther a heretic and an outlaw, set a reward for his capture, and threatened anyone who dared shelter him. Charles won the room that day. He lost the century. Luther was spirited out of reach by Frederick the Wise of Saxony, hidden away inside a castle, and spent the quiet stretch translating scripture and writing a large slab of the Reformation, while the emperor's grand decree did precisely nothing to slow the printing presses already running across Germany. The fugitive that the emperor had personally outlawed went on to remake European Christianity from a safe house, with a price still on his head. There is a hard lesson buried in that about the limits of a signature, even an imperial one. The second great problem of his life wore a crown of his own and carried a personal grudge to match it. Francis I of France was born in 1494, 6 years ahead of Charles, and the pair spent 3 decades circling each other like two men seated at the wrong table who could never quite let it go. Their rivalry set the shape of European politics for an entire generation. It came to its sharpest point in 1525 at the Battle of Pavia, where Charles's army shattered the French and captured the King of France himself on the field. Francis then spent the better part of a year as a prisoner in Madrid, lodged inside the Alcazar, one anointed king kept like an awkward houseguest in another king's palace. To buy his way out, Francis signed the Treaty of Madrid in 1526 and the terms were a humiliation wearing the costume of diplomacy. He was to surrender Burgundy, marry Charles's sister Eleanor, and join Charles in arms against the Ottoman Turks. They released him on the 17th of March. His good faith lasted roughly as long as the ride home. By the 10th of May, his royal council had formally thrown the treaty out, arguing that a promise squeezed from a prisoner was no promise at all, and on the 22nd he signed onto the League of Cognac, an alliance pointed straight at Charles that gathered up Milan, Venice, Pope Clement VII, and later Florence and England as well. The tale handed down is that Francis signed the original treaty with his fingers crossed, privately swearing it was worthless the moment his pen left the parchment. Charles read the whole thing as raw personal betrayal, and the poison between the two of them never drained out. Later they paused the war with the Truce of Nice in 1538, brokered by Pope Paul III, and then went straight back to fighting within a few years, because neither of them really knew how to stop being each other's enemy. The strangest move in the entire feud belonged to Francis. At one point, the Christian king of a Christian kingdom reached out to Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Sultan, and arranged a military alliance against Charles. Let that one land properly. A Catholic monarch shook hands with the single greatest Muslim power of the age, specifically to gang up on a Catholic emperor, and the courts of Europe were scandalized to their bones by it. Charles had spent his life presenting himself as the sword and shield of Christendom. His chief rival went and partnered with the very empire that Christendom kept telling itself it was crusading against. If you ever wondered how genuine the religious high ground of these wars really was, there is your answer, signed and sealed. Step back from the individual treaties and the whole feud looks almost comic in its futility. Two men born 6 years apart spent the bulk of their adult lives trying to wreck each other, and when one of them died, the wars carried on anyway under fresh names. Francis went into the ground in 1547, Charles outlived him by 11 years, and never did land the total victory the rivalry kept dangling in front of him. All those campaigns, the king captured on the field, the treaty signed and broken, the handshake with the Sultan, and by the end the map of Europe sat stubbornly close to where it had started. That is what these grand contests between powerful men so often deliver. Vast effort, vaster expense, and a board reset to nearly the opening position. The irony cut deeper still, because the worst wound Charles's pious self-image was one his own soldiers dealt him. In May of 1527, his troops descended on Rome and sacked it. A large share of them were German mercenaries, the Landsknechte. Many of them Lutheran and openly contemptuous of the Pope, and a great many of them unpaid and furious about exactly that. They looted the Vatican, wrecked churches, killed in the streets, and locked up Pope Clement VII, the same pope who had thrown in with the League against Charles in the first place. The damage to the city was enormous and took years to undo. Charles, who sincerely thought of himself as the church's protector on earth, reportedly pulled on mourning clothes and publicly disowned the entire episode, none of which changed the plain fact that it happened under his command, carried out by men marching beneath his banner, who tore the holy city apart largely because nobody had paid them, and Rome was stuffed with portable gold. The most Catholic emperor in Europe is also the man whose army imprisoned the Pope. He never fully lived that down, and he should not have. There is a quieter oddity sitting underneath all of this, which is that the great Spanish emperor was not really Spanish at all, at least not at the beginning. He was born in Ghent and raised in the Netherlands, and he came to the Spanish crown as an outsider who handled the local language poorly and leaned at first on Flemish and Burgundian advisors, which the Spanish nobility resented out loud and at length. His sense of himself as a Castilian king, rather than a Burgundian prince who happened to also hold Spain, arrived late in his life rather than early. The man who had one day asked to die in a Spanish monastery had started out a foreigner inside his own most valuable kingdom. The legends grew fast around someone living a life like this, and one of them has outlasted nearly everything he actually accomplished. You have probably run into the line about the languages, the one where Charles supposedly declared that he spoke Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to his horse. It is a good line. He never said it. The earliest version anyone has tracked down appears in a 1601 book on speech by the Italian anatomist Girolamo Fabrizi d'Acquapendente, more than 4 decades after Charles was already in the ground, and the saying kept shifting into fresh forms for another 2 centuries after that. The real man genuinely was fluent across several tongues, raised in the Netherlands, switching language as easily as he switched territories, which is exactly why the invented quote stuck so neatly to him. It sounded like something he might plausibly have said. History simply could not be bothered to wait for him to actually say it before stuffing the words into his mouth and carving them onto his reputation. What he did at the close of his reign had almost no precedent in European history, and it is the strongest evidence that his exit was engineered rather than merely suffered. Nearly every ruler of his era left power the same way, by dying in the middle of it, usually badly. Charles decided instead to walk out while still alive, in deliberate stages, on a timetable he set himself. On the 25th of October, 1555, in the Hall of the Golden Fleece in the Coudenberg Palace in Brussels, he formally handed the Netherlands to his son Philip. By then he was so depleted that he leaned the whole way through the ceremony on the shoulder of a young nobleman, a man named William of Orange. The hall did not hold its composure. Witnesses described nobles openly weeping, and the emperor himself in tears as he gave away the lands where his own life had begun half a century earlier. Then he did the whole thing again behind closed doors. On the 16th of January, 1556, away from any crowd, he signed Spain and its overseas empire over to Philip as well. Rulers of that era did not typically stand before their assembled nobility and weep while handing power away. Power was a thing you clutched until it was pried loose by death or rebellion. Charles instead turned his own resignation into a piece of public theatre, leaning visibly on another man because his legs would not carry him, letting the whole room watch exactly how worn down the great emperor had become. It was either an act of startling humility or an act of total control, the staging of the one transition most rulers never lived to direct. In Charles, those two impulses rarely travelled apart. He had concluded that his monstrous inheritance was simply too much for any single pair of hands, so he cut it apart on purpose rather than wait for it to tear itself. Philip, raised Spanish to the bone, received Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and the Americas. Charles's younger brother Ferdinand, who had already been governing Central Europe as regent for years, received the Holy Roman Empire. This was not a collapse, and it was not a seizure of power by rivals while he was too weak to resist. It was an emperor running succession planning on a scale nobody had attempted before, slicing his own life's work in two while he was still alive to watch, the cut take hold and hold steady. It is fair to ask what actually drove the man off the stage, and the honest answer is that the sources do not cleanly separate the reasons. The body is the part we can prove. The gout was real and worsening, the hands had failed, the appetite for endless travel was long gone. There was also plain exhaustion after 40 years of governing something that resisted being governed, and a deep, genuine religiosity that pulled him toward a quiet finish behind monastery walls. Untangling how much of the abdication was illness, how much was burnout, and how much was faith is something the record will not let anyone do with confidence. Most likely it was all three at once, braided so tightly that even Charles might not have been able to name the strongest strand. Then he went up into the hills to die, and he flatly refused to be hurried about it. Charles reached Just in February of 1557, drawn there by the mild climate and in equal measure by how far the place sat from absolutely everything. He did not sink into total monastic silence either. Intelligence still reached him in his cell. He kept writing to Philip about the affairs of Europe, an aging emperor pressing advice on the son now carrying the weight he had finally set down. The texture of that retirement is what makes it impossible to forget, and it gets genuinely peculiar the closer you look. He brought clockmakers with him. Charles had developed a deep fixation on mechanical clocks and timepieces, and he packed his final residence with them, and with the craftsmen who built and tuned them, surrounding himself with delicate machines whose entire purpose was to measure, precisely, the one thing he had nearly run out of. Then there are the funerals. By accounts widely repeated about his final months, Charles arranged mock funeral services for himself while he was still breathing, lying down in a coffin and listening to the death rites read aloud over his own living body, rehearsing the end the way a lesser man might rehearse a toast. A ruler who had choreographed the orderly handover of half the known world could not, it seems, resist directing his own last scene as well. Some men retired to fish. This one retired to attend his own burial in advance, and tinker with the gears of clocks that kept perfect time he no longer had. The clocks are the detail that lingers. A man who had spent 40 years racing between territories always behind, always summoned somewhere new, retired to fill a stone room with machines whose single purpose was to carve time into exact, obedient pieces and hold it in place. He could no longer command much of anything else, so he commanded his clocks instead, and let them tick around him at the edge of the country, counting down with mechanical patience toward the funeral he had already rehearsed more than once. When the end actually came, on the 21st of September, 1558, the cause was nowhere near as tidy as the older stories insist. For generations, people repeated that malaria carried him off. The same 2004 study that read his gout straight out of his finger went hunting for the malaria parasite in the remains and found no trace of it whatsoever, which leaves the precise medical cause of death genuinely unsettled to this day. What is beyond any argument at all is the state of the body that was doing the dying. Decades of gout had chewed through his joints, frozen his movement, and stripped him of the use of his own hands. The mightiest ruler of his age spent his final stretch of life unable to grip a pen, hauled from room to room on a litter, listening to his own funeral performed on repeat, dying in a monastery as far from any seat of government as he could possibly arrange it. He had ruled everywhere and chose to die in the one corner of his world where no one needed anything from him. The division he engineered outlasted him by a span that would have stunned the man himself. The Spanish line he handed to Philip ran on until 1700. The Austrian line he handed to Ferdinand survived all the way to 1918, when the First World War swept away the last of the Habsburg thrones. He did far more than abdicate. He redrew the question of who would rule what across the continent for the next 4 centuries. The bloodline kept its grim appointment too. The same habit of marrying inside the family that handed Charles his jaw and loaded his body with ailments ran straight to its end in Charles II, the broken final Spanish Habsburg who could barely function and left no child behind, closing the line in 1700 exactly as the genetics had been promising for generations. And the man who sat near the top of that family tree finished as a fragment in a stranger's drawer, a sliver of finger bribed out of a crypt, surrendering under a microscope the one confession nobody had thought to write down while he lived.